Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Libby Murray, and I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight on Lifetime's Adoption webinar. We're going to talk about the top 3 mistakes that adoptive parents make when they're funding their adoptions. We're also going to talk about some of the tips to just keep in mind as you're planning to adopt, as you're preparing your budget. No matter what phase you're in, you can usually use these tips. So even if you haven't yet taken the first step to even beginning an adoption program, all the way to if you're already waiting within a program like Lifetimes, for instance, you can apply these tips, keep them in mind, because most families continue to put funds towards their adoption budget even after they've gotten well onto a path toward that adoption. So for instance, a lot of families will start with Lifetime and then continue to find ways to grow their adoption funds so that maybe they can be presented to more opportunities, or maybe they can be prepared in case unexpected expenses come up. You just never know. And so all of these tips we hope tonight will not only equip you, but help you be aware of questions to ask and things to watch out for, things to look for, because we really want to help the process be as smooth as possible for you, but also as safe as possible and as smart as possible. And what I mean by that, by safe and smart, is, you know, Kim, we've talked before about how every adoption does come with a risk. And really, I think that a lot of our life's journeys and the goals that we seek out, they usually come with some kind of risk. That's what makes them, you know, bigger than just a to-do list. And with adoption, certainly a lot of people worry, you know, what happens if a woman changes her mind? What happens if, you know, we don't end up getting to adopt that child? But another big concern is, you know, what happens if we can't afford an adoption that we want to pursue, or what happens if we, you know, risk a lot financially and then we end up not adopting. So we want to recognize those tonight, but just, you know, to point out that a lot of these things are things that we have seen happen, unfortunately, that we want to help you avoid so that you can stretch your adoption dollars, so that you aren't overspending, so that you are truly investing in the adoption of your dreams in the best possible way with as little risk as possible. So I want to cover here, Kim, what are some of the tips? And I'm going to bring up a slide here too, so if you're online you can see some of our visuals tonight. And I wanted to point out all of these pictures. We have a few of them to show of these beautiful families. These are all families who have recently adopted. So you can enjoy these along with our tips tonight. But Kim, what are some of the tips I know that you go over with adoptive parents when they are, you know, just maybe even beginning to prepare their adoption budget, or when they're starting to think about, okay, now there's this aspect I need to get together?
I would say that for most families who are new to exploring adoption, the cost associated with the services, the fees associated with all the services along the way to create a safe and successful adoption, it's usually a huge surprise to families. I don't think that the cost of adoption services, it's just not something that's openly discussed when people share their adoption story. So that's the part of it that's kind of like, you know, in the shadows, but we want to shed light on that. And certainly, if you have specific questions about the specific budget for a Lifetime family, feel free to email that question to me, and I'll communicate with you to kind of get an understanding for you of all the little expenses and larger expenses as well. My email is kim@lifetimeadoption.com. And this is something that I usually discuss in detail with a family who is strongly considering moving forward or just looking into Lifetime, and we are strongly considering offering them an opening into our program. So I'd say the strong consideration is more on Lifetimes, and families are at all different places in their journey, whether just new and learning or have already been looking at Lifetime for many years. I would say that it's important to know all of the costs associated so that you're not surprised later on. And we're going to talk about this a little bit too, Libby. I mean, the tips that I give are within our outline, but to really stop and take a look at your resources. And I would say the biggest tip is don't shut the door on any possibilities until you've really made that effort to see what you're able to do within the next 3, 6 months, year and a half, 2 years. And I know that can seem like a long time, but if you want a certain program and you want this done correctly, safely, securely, then it may be that Rome wasn't built in a day. This is a step-by-step process. It's certainly a relationship-building process between Lifetime and a new family we're considering, bringing on board with us. So that, I would say, is one of the biggest things, is just to know that this is not all going to be done in one day. Well, at least for most families. I would say almost all families are not able to just fund their adoption right away. It's going to take effort, serious consideration. And after you've done all that work and put in all that effort towards your adoption budget, then we're going to share with you these tips so that you don't end up kind of undermining your own adoption by making mistakes we're going to share with you tonight, how to avoid those.
Kim, I'm so glad that you started off with don't panic if it looks impossible today. I think one of the biggest stereotypes or misunderstandings about adoptive parents these days is that they all have money to spare. And because that's a common thing we hear is, well, I'm not like all those other parents on your website. I don't just have adoption fees right now. Well, the majority of people that you know who have adopted or that you see on our site waiting to adopt, for instance, they didn't just wake up one morning with adoption fees ready to go. They planned, they saved, they may have fundraised, and there's a whole other webinar where we did talk about that, I know, not too long ago, Kim. So there's another webinar where you could actually get some of those tips, those insights on how other families have come up with their adoption expenses. But I love what you said, because if it's laid on your heart, keep taking steps to explore that. Just like, I know many teenagers who want to go, they know they want to go to a certain college. They want to have certain academic goals. But even their parents may not have the means, when they're 14, 15 years old and they start developing this dream. But over time, and it doesn't take that long, they can start looking into the resources available to help them with those costs or to minimize those costs. They can save, certainly. Whatever it is, it's a dream that they made happen, and maybe it didn't happen the moment the dream sprouted, but as it grew and you prepare, just like many of you, I'm sure, Kim, we hear all the time, which is another aspect we could probably do a whole webinar on, but I know that a lot of adoptive parents come through a journey of infertility that was very costly on their financial resources. So by the time you decide you want to adopt, sometimes you're feeling exhausted financially as well as emotionally, but you still want to become parents or build your family, so you want to pursue this dream. Like Kim was saying, look into the types of adoption, but also the services that are required for those, what you really want to pursue, and then keep asking questions, keep searching for answers. And I brought up a slide here, Kim. We have these basic tips here before we dive into the 3 most common mistakes. I know you touched on this briefly, but research the type of adoption you want to pursue and the average services and costs necessary to complete it. And the reason we emphasize this is because there are different types of adoption. Not one type is right for every hopeful family. But, number 2 is, like you were saying, Kim, avoid choosing what type of adoption you want to pursue just based on the costs. I know a lot of parents I hear from, they've often started, for instance, foster adoptions sometimes foster adoption sometimes can be very minimal in cost, although if you take into consideration all of the taxes put in for the government to fund those, that's a different story altogether. But in the end, sometimes the wait is longer, or maybe the opportunities they're presented just based on their area aren't what they're comfortable saying yes to, and then so they end up looking into other types of adoption, and the reason they started with that initially was because they wanted to, basically choose an adoption path based on what they wanted to invest. And I think that that's reasonable to weigh in, certainly, because we're going to talk about how you need to be honest about your own situation and your own goals when it comes to your finances, but also your adoption, and find that balance. But don't just choose a type of adoption only because of the costs you anticipate. Likewise, don't avoid one based on what you think and what you've heard. Get the answers and then decide based on what you see in black and white.
Right. I think a good way to look at it as don't assume, don't assume that international adoption is the most expensive, or don't assume that domestic adoption is less expensive, because I've heard of ranges that are very surprising to me when I assumed that domestic should be less expensive than international. It's not always, or vice versa. It's not always. I think that there have been many changes in many programs across our country to where sometimes now international adoption is less expensive than some domestic programs, and some domestic agencies are charging more than typically you would see for an international adoption.
Right. I think too, like we were talking about, this next general tip would be, to consider your emotionals, your personal goals, the time that you want to spend waiting to adopt, in with, okay, how can we pursue this logistically and financially? And be honest with yourself about how much you can budget, how much you can save, and how much you can pay back. If you take out loans, or if you're waiting to be reimbursed, maybe through the tax credit or employee benefits. Kim, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My phone thing did a little cutout, and I was just a little concerned. So, to always, every family has a different scenario. That's what I really want to emphasize tonight, and that's why it's so important to reach out to us and contact the places you're considering to help you one-on-one, as well as getting general information, because not every general answer is going to apply to every single family. And then also keep perspective about adoption fees. And what we mean by that is, again, like Kim said, don't just assume one generality over a certain type of adoption, or over the possibilities of covering adoption expenses in general. Like, get answers, find out what's possible, what's realistic, what you want to do, and keep moving forward based on what you know, not on fears, not on what you hear from other people, but what you're actually finding out. We don't want to dive too much into this because this certainly is different for every family, but also, when you're considering your adoption budget, you need to think over the question, what am I going to do if there's an unexpected cost associated with the adoption that I end up pursuing? So let's say you get matched with a birth mother who wants you to adopt her baby, and then if there's an unexpected legal hiccup or something that you're going to need an extra $1,000 or an extra couple thousand to, say, get you home, or whatever that could be, do you have a little wiggle room there? Do you at least have a resource you could contact? For instance, I know my family's really close, and I don't lean on them for financial support, but I know that if I were pursuing a dream, a goal as big as an adoption, that I could call them in an unexpected situation and say, we have everything except this amount, and do you think you could help us meet this? Do you think you could help us come up with this? Other times it might be a line of credit, padding your savings until you get matched so that that is available to tap into. But you don't necessarily want to over-anticipate unexpected costs because then that's unnecessary planning too. And then Kim, like you started off with tonight, make sure you're paying for services that your adoption needs and requires. And this is across the board with any type of adoption. You don't need to pay for umbrella services that you may or may not use. Pay for what your adoption is going to require. And sometimes we like to say at Lifetime that our adoptions are sort of a la carte. So you're just, hiring an attorney based on what your adoption needs and where your adoption's happening. If your child's birth mother doesn't require, say her medical bills covered, then why pay up front to cover those in case they happen? Only cover those when they arise, when they are presented, and when you've approved, yes, we can do that.
Or, for example, if you hire an agency in another state and part of the fee for their program covers adoption service or home study services, but obviously they're in another state. They can't do your home study because that has to be done locally.
Right.
So maybe talk with them about that to understand that. And that's where Lifetime is a la carte. We work nationwide, so families get their home studies done locally, are able to choose a home study provider they feel comfortable with and work on that home study together, and then just have them send the completed copy to Lifetime. So since you're paying for that individual service, you're reducing your overhead.
Mm-hmm. We had a great question here a little bit ago come in. Thank you, Angel. It says, are the legal fees included in the cost of an adoption through Lifetime? And of course, Kim would be glad to walk through what you can expect with Lifetime and what families usually have to budget to complete an adoption through Lifetime. But to generally answer, no, legal fees are not included in Lifetime's fees, and that's to help spare you expenses in the long run so that you're only hiring the legal services that your adoption will require. And if you have any questions like that are more specific to Lifetime's program or to your situation, again, you can always email Kim. I know that you are glad to answer questions, and you're pretty hot on your email. And you can always write to Kim at lifetimeadoption.com, or you can always call our office too and make sure you talk with somebody. We had another question here. I wanted to get these questions in here. Alexandria, thank you. My husband and I are wondering if we could be involved with state DSHS, such as foster care, as well as being involved with a private adoption agency to maybe increase our adoption possibilities. And with Lifetime, yes, not with all adoption agencies, not with all adoption professionals. So you want to make sure that you're asking that of whoever you're interviewing to help you along this path so that one doesn't stop you from the other.
You know what, that's a really good point that lends itself to another tip, that if you're planning to also pursue becoming pregnant or also pursue finding a birth mom through word of mouth through your networking and have an adoption professional matching with a birth mom, be sure that your adoption professional you've hired doesn't have a clause that closes out your program if you should become pregnant or matched outside of their program. So be very upfront with that and find out what their procedure is. Say that you're successful in your attempts outside of their program. Now what becomes of your program with them? Are they able to still pursue your adoption within their program? Or like with Lifetime, our families have the option of going on hold if they wanted. So I would say we're really flexible, but again, don't assume that every program is. And as far as simultaneously pursuing foster to adopt or fostering and private adoption where that's the only intent is for you to adopt, make sure you're your social services social worker supports you with that too, because you don't want to unnecessarily burn that bridge with them if they could have some opportunities for you. Just really approach it very respectfully with them and find out the facts and make sure you're talking to the right person who can give you the answer that you're looking for. Because say you have a child in your home that you're fostering and they become available for adoption, but then a social worker finds out that you are considering private adoption, they might take it the wrong way and remove that child from your home that you were hoping to adopt that child if they were available.
Right, and
So
that can depend sometimes even on county or state laws too.
Yeah.
So those are all great questions. You want to make sure. I'm kind of a list maker, so whenever I have these kinds of questions, I hope that all of you are keeping notebooks or something so that you can check them off as you get the answers from the people that that you are researching or the people that you are working with, because they are necessary questions. They are great questions to protect you and your adoption dream in the long run. And Kim, that's such a good point, because it can go either way.
And along with paying for services your adoption needs, Libby, are you there? I'm sorry, it kind of blurped out for a second.
Can you hear me?
So along with paying for services that your adoption needs, this is why we don't have our families pay for legal services until they are matched. So that way, in a program like ours where it's nationwide, say you're in, say you're in Texas and the birth mom is in North Dakota, well, what if you only need a North Dakota adoption attorney? Or what if you hired a Texas attorney who can't operate for that North Dakota adoption? You're kind of limited